During the course of our conversations, Bill pointed out that what is generally interpreted as the end of the world is actually the end of the age, the end of the Old Covenant age, or the law. In Revelation, where we read about plagues and judgments poured out upon the earth, an alternate translation, and more accurate according to preterists, is not upon the whole planet, but upon the land of Judea. The 1260 days, the 42 months, and the time, times, and half a time in Revelation correspond to the 3.5 years of the Roman siege of Jerusalem between AD 66 and 70. During this time period, the Jewish historian Josephus records the death of over 1 million Jews by sword, famine, earthquakes, and so on. These events actually fit quite nicely with the prophecies of Jesus and of Revelation. Well, maybe it sounded good to Bill, but I wasn't going to take his word for it. However, I was intrigued by the parallels that were suggested. So as I study, I find out that in those end of the world passages, the Greek word that is translated world is not cosmos, from which we get our cosmos, the physical heavens and earth, but aion, from which we get eon, or age. In fact, modern translations read the end of the age. And the Hebrew and Greek words for earth can be understood to mean the local area, like say Judea. In fact, in Matthew chapter 9, after Jesus healed 2 blind men and told them not to tell anyone, this same Greek word is used to tell us that they spread the news in all that land. The holes in the preterist view weren't as easy to find as I had anticipated, but I knew they were there. Then I looked at some of the quotes from Josephus and was amazed at the atrocities that took place during the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Time prohibits me from going into detail, but there was famine, wholesale death, earthquakes, and so on, of biblical proportions, literally. Josephus even writes about false prophets, false messiahs, and family members turning on one another. He writes about the Roman armies desecrating the temple by the presence of the eagles on their shields and standards, and how the Jews considered it an abomination just to have the Roman armies in the environs of Jerusalem, which they considered a holy place. Abomination and desolation in the holy place. That couldn't be what Jesus... Nah. Now keep in mind that what I'm giving you is a Reader's Digest condensed version of several years of conversations, study, and reading. Each one of these subtopics could easily have a book dedicated to it. Here are some of the books I read as I endeavored to find the holes in preterism. Evangelist John Bray has traveled the globe preaching, and he took advantage of this by doing research in some of the great theological libraries around the world. He has a series of little books which cover Matthew 24's version of the Olivet Discourse. These booklets were later combined to create his book, Matthew 24 Fulfilled. Of course, there was the Parousia, a couple books by Philip Morrow, and there was Max King and Ken Gentry, R.C. Sproul, Ed Stevens, plus numerous internet articles. I wanted to do a thorough job. And this was before I became aware of Don Preston's material. Josephus actually records that there were supernatural occurrences witnessed by many during this war, like armies of chariots racing across the sky, and the doors to the temple, which took 20 men to close, opening by themselves in the middle of the night, and the night being lit so brightly that it seemed as if it were noon. Josephus wrote that the priest understood these signs to mean that God was bringing judgment upon the Jews. Now, if someone was to pretend, just pretend, mind you, that Revelation was written prior to AD 70, and that both it and Jesus' prophecy on the Mount of Olives were to be interpreted in the same manner as every other Old Testament prophecy with similar language, then there certainly seem to be a lot of details of those prophecies that fit with the destruction of Jerusalem. Just pretending, though, right? But I wasn't worried. I had an ace up my sleeve. You see, I was fairly familiar with all of this AD 70 stuff from a Bible teacher on TV. He taught from a Messianic Jewish perspective, and revealed all of the typology in the festivals, the tabernacle, the temple sacrifices and ceremonies, and so on. And he had covered this AD-70 stuff. It was a type, a rehearsal, a foreshadow, a partial fulfillment of the ultimate fulfillment to come at the end of the world. I had hours of videotape on this stuff. No problem. This seems as good a place as any to mention one of the books that I read during this whole expedition. The book is Before Jerusalem Fell by Kenneth Gentry, Jr. In it, he attempts to establish that the book of Revelation was written prior to AD-70. Well, in my opinion, he did. Convincingly, unquestionably, resoundingly. You get the picture. Lest you think that I was just a pushover, consider these quotes used by R.C. Sproul in The Last Days According to Jesus.
The burden of preterists then is to demonstrate that Revelation was written before AD 70. This burden became the thesis of Gentry's doctoral dissertation. His book Before Jerusalem Fell has been welcomed both by the advocates of preterism and by its opponents. J. E. Adams says of Before Jerusalem Fell, "Here is a book some of us have been awaiting for years. Now that it is here, we can rejoice." Mr. Gentry convincingly demonstrates the fact that the book of Revelation was written, as it in so many ways declares, prior to the destruction of Jerusalem. In AD 70, it should receive a wide reading and ought to rattle many windows. George W. Knight, who is not a preterist, says this: "Before Jerusalem Fell is a thorough and understanding statement of the case for the early date of Revelation. The book makes one aware of the evidence from within the book and from early church sources, and surveys the arguments of New Testament scholars for this century and previous centuries concerning the question. No stone is left unturned to resolve the question."
In his book, Gentry lists several pages of scholars through the centuries who have held an early date for the authorship of Revelation. Most who hold this position believe that the beast of Revelation was Nero, who violently persecuted Christians. This view is strengthened by the fact that it fits the time frame of the events of Revelation, which John wrote were at hand and were to shortly take place. John was also told that the 7 heads of the beast represented 7 kings, 5 of whom had died, the 6th was currently reigning, and the 7th king had not yet come to power. Gentry notes that, counting from Julius Caesar, the first in the line of Caesars, Nero was the 6th king. Furthermore, when written in Hebrew, the numeric value of Nero's name is 666. I now had to admit that preterists were right on one point. Revelation was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. But thank goodness that doesn't establish a whole doctrine. Just because it was written prior to the destruction of Jerusalem doesn't mean that it is necessarily describing that event. Right? Once again, a quote from Sproul.
Even if Gentry has dated Revelation correctly, that still does not exclude the possibility of a future manifestation of the beast, in accord with a primary and secondary schema of prophetic fulfillment. But is such a schema necessary if the events foretold in Revelation concern the imminent judgment of the Jewish nation and the destruction of Jerusalem?
Although I was relieved that Sproul left the door open for both an early date for the writing of Revelation and future fulfillments, his underwhelming support for a primary and secondary fulfillment weren't exactly reassuring. Oh, while we're on the subject, check this out in Sproul's book. It's dedicated to Garrett. Yep, it's the same Garrett that Bill and I know. Can you believe that? You can imagine why I felt like a net was being drawn in around me.